Hey there, lovely souls. Tonight we're settling in for something deliciously dark and utterly fascinating. We're ranking Henry VIII's 6 wives, from the brilliant survivors to the tragic victims. And trust me, what you're about to discover will completely change how you see these remarkable women. Before we begin our journey through the Tudor court's most dangerous game, take a moment to like this video if you're ready for some royal secrets. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing our beautiful community gathering from around the world to share these intimate, historical moments together. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle, and let's slip back 5 centuries to a time when being queen meant playing chess with your life as the stakes. In 1533, a young woman's neck was measured for an executioner's sword. She had been Queen of England for less than 3 years. Her crime? Failing to give the king a son. But what her executioners didn't know was that this failed queen had just secured England's future through the daughter they dismissed as worthless. Anne Boleyn wasn't just Henry's wife. She was his obsession, his destruction, and ultimately his most lasting triumph. But she ranks nowhere near the top of our list tonight. Because survival, my dear listeners, required skills that passion alone could never provide. These 6 women faced an impossible task, keeping Henry VIII happy while navigating the deadliest court in Europe. Each brought different weapons to this battle: intelligence, beauty, political cunning, religious conviction, or simple human warmth. Some mastered the game, others were destroyed by it, but every single one of them changed England forever. Tonight we're ranking them not by how much Henry loved them, but by something far more important: how brilliantly they played the most dangerous game in Tudor England. And what we discover will shock you. Picture this: you're a noblewoman in the 1500s, and the King of England wants to marry you. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? Wrong. It's a death sentence with a crown. Henry VIII wasn't just a king. He was a force of nature, wrapped in velvet and paranoia, 6 feet tall, athletic in his youth, with a voice that could charm or terrify depending on his mood. By his later years, he was a bloated, ulcerated tyrant whose leg wounds smelled so badly that courtiers could track his approach by the stench. But here's what makes this story so compelling. His wives weren't helpless victims. These were some of the most intelligent, politically savvy women of their age. They had to be. Survival in Henry's court required the cunning of a spy, the grace of a diplomat, and the nerves of a gambler. The rules of their deadly game were simple: give Henry a son, never challenge his ego, navigate court politics without making enemies, maintain your dignity under impossible pressure, and never ever let him get bored. Fail at any of these and you might find yourself in the Tower of London, practicing how to lay your head on a block. What makes tonight's ranking so fascinating is that we're not judging these women by Henry's standards. We're judging them by something far more important. How brilliantly did they protect themselves while trying to survive marriage to one of history's most dangerous men? Some of them didn't just survive, they thrived. Others paid the ultimate price for trusting love over strategy. And one of them, incredibly, managed to outlive Henry himself and find true happiness. Can you guess which one? The answers will surprise you, because the wife who ranks number 1 isn't who you think it is. Number 6, Catherine Howard, the child who never had a chance. Our tragic last place goes to Catherine Howard, and before you protest, hear me out. This ranking isn't about her worth as a person, it's about survival skills in the Tudor court. And Catherine's story is heartbreaking precisely because she never had the chance to develop them. Catherine was born around 1523, making her roughly 19 when she was executed. 19. Let that sink in for a moment. She was younger than most college students today when she lost her head for the crime of being human. Her childhood was a disaster waiting to happen. Raised in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, Catherine grew up with minimal supervision and even less education. While other noble girls learned languages, diplomacy, and court etiquette, Catherine learned music and dancing. Lovely accomplishments, but utterly inadequate preparation for queenship. The Howard family saw Catherine as their ticket back to power after Anne Boleyn's execution. They dressed her up, presented her to the king, and basically fed her to the wolf. Henry, now massive and intimidating, was enchanted by her youth and vivacity. She had auburn hair, a typically hooked Howard nose, and what one ambassador delicately called sex appeal. But here's the truly tragic part. Catherine had already been sexually exploited by older men from the age of 12. Her music teacher, Henry Manox, began an inappropriate relationship with her when she was just a child. Then Francis Derham, a gentleman retainer, took advantage of her when she was around 14. These weren't romances, they were predatory relationships with a girl who had no one to protect her. When Catherine became queen, she tried to be kind. She was generous to Anne of Cleves, Henry's previous wife, and attempted to build relationships with her stepchildren. Contemporary accounts describe her as kind-hearted and good-natured, but empty-headed and frivolous. All she cared for was dancing and merrymaking. This assessment seems harsh until you realise what it really tells us. Catherine was still essentially a teenager, thrust into a role that would have challenged women twice her age with 10 times her education. Her downfall came through Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Catherine fell genuinely in love, perhaps for the first time in her life, with someone close to her own age. The letter she wrote to him reveals her complete infatuation. She signed it, "Yours as long as life endures." It's the letter of a girl who believed in fairy tale endings. But in Henry's court, queens couldn't afford to believe in fairy tales. Her secret meetings with Culpeper were discovered, and suddenly her past relationships were reframed as adultery and treason. The Howards, who had pushed her toward the throne, now abandoned her completely to save themselves. Catherine's final days show both her terror and her dignity. She practiced laying her head on the execution block the night before her death, determined to die with grace. When they came for her on February 13th, 1542, she walked to her death with composure that belied her years. Here's what's most heartbreaking. Catherine Howard was probably guilty of nothing more than being young, poorly educated, and romantically naive in a world that demanded political calculation. Her real crime was trusting the adults who should have protected her. The question that haunts me is this: what might Catherine have become with proper education, genuine protection, and time to mature? We'll never know, because she was sacrificed to her family's ambitions and Henry's increasingly paranoid demands. Catherine Howard ranks last, not because she was weak, but because she was never given the tools to be strong. In a game where survival required decades of careful preparation, she was thrown in defenseless. And that, more than anything, makes her story a tragedy of the system that created it. Number 5. Jane Seymour, the perfect performance that ended too soon. Jane Seymour achieved something none of Henry's other wives managed. She gave him a son and died before she could disappoint him. It sounds cynical, but in the deadly mathematics of Tudor queenship, timing was everything. Jane was born around 1508 at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, making her part of the rising gentry rather than high nobility. This worked in her favour. She was high enough in status to be acceptable as queen, but not so politically connected that her family posed a threat to Henry's power. Here's where Jane's brilliance becomes clear. She understood exactly what Henry needed after the chaos of Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had been dramatic, Jane was serene. Where Anne had challenged and argued, Jane submitted and agreed. Where Anne had been European and sophisticated, Jane embodied English domesticity. But don't mistake this for weakness. Jane's submissiveness was a carefully calculated performance, and it was masterful. She chose the motto, "Bound to obey and serve," and selected a phoenix as her badge, symbolising rebirth from the ashes of Anne Boleyn's reign. These weren't random choices, they were political messaging of the highest order. Jane's survival strategy was to become the anti-Anne. She dressed modestly where Anne had been fashionable. She kept her opinions to herself where Anne had been outspoken. She focused on domestic accomplishments, like embroidery. Her needlework was so beautiful, it survived until the 1650s. Most cleverly, Jane positioned herself as a peacemaker. She attempted to reconcile Henry with his daughter Mary, showing political wisdom by trying to heal the religious divide that Anne Boleyn had helped create. This wasn't just kindness, it was brilliant politics that appealed to Henry's growing desire for stability. And then Jane accomplished the impossible. She gave Henry the male heir he'd been desperately seeking for over 20 years. Prince Edward's birth on October 12, 1537, was Henry's greatest triumph, and it validated Jane's entire approach to queenship. But here's the tragic irony. Jane's greatest triumph became her death sentence. She developed puerperal fever, probably from a retained placenta or infection, and died 12 days after giving birth. Henry was devastated, not just by grief, but by the cruel twist that his moment of greatest joy became his greatest loss. Jane's death at her moment of triumph created something her survival never could have: perfection. She became Henry's true wife in his memory, the one who gave him his son, and never lived to complicate that legacy. He was buried beside her, and she appears in all official Tudor family portraits as the mother of the heir. But here's what's fascinating about Jane. We'll never know what she might have accomplished with more time. Her political instincts were excellent, her survival skills were sophisticated, and her ability to read Henry's psychological needs was nearly perfect. Given a few more years, she might have ranked much higher on our list. Think about this. During her brief 18 months as queen, Jane managed to restore stability to the court, reconcile religious factions, advance her family's position without creating enemies, and provide the male heir that had eluded Henry for 2 decades. That's not luck, that's skill. Jane Seymour ranks 5th because she mastered the performance of Tudor queenship, but never had the chance to prove whether she could sustain it long term. Her tragedy isn't that she died young, but that we'll never know how brilliant she might have become with time to fully develop her political abilities. In the deadly game of royal marriage, Jane Seymour played a perfect short game. Whether she could have maintained that perfection over years of increasing pressure remains one of history's great what-ifs. Number 4, Anne Boleyn, the revolutionary who changed everything. Here's where our ranking gets controversial, because Anne Boleyn is simultaneously one of the most successful and most catastrophically failed queens in English history. She changed everything, and it cost her everything. Anne was born around 1501, probably at Blickling Hall in Norfolk. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was politically ambitious, and he invested heavily in his daughter's educations. Anne was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, then to France, where she acquired the continental Polish that would make her so distinctive in Henry's provincial court. When Anne returned to England, she was unlike anything the English court had seen. She was fluent in French, sophisticated in manners, and intellectually curious in ways that set her apart from the typical court beauty. She read reformist literature, engaged in theological discussions, and had opinions on politics, revolutionary behaviour for a woman of her time. But here's what made Anne truly dangerous. She understood her own power and refused to give it away cheaply. When Henry began pursuing her, probably around 1526, Anne made a decision that would reshape English history. She refused to become his mistress. This wasn't moral squeamishness, it was political calculation of the highest order. Anne had watched her sister, Mary, become Henry's mistress, and then be discarded with nothing to show for it but scandal. Anne demanded marriage or nothing, and she had the willpower to make that demand stick. For 7 years, Anne kept Henry pursuing her while she maintained her virginity and built her political position. 7 years. Think about the psychological discipline that required. Henry was the most powerful man in England, accustomed to getting what he wanted immediately. Anne made him wait, and she used that time brilliantly. During those 7 years, Anne became the unofficial Queen of England. She held court, advised Henry on policy, and built a faction of supporters who saw her as the future. She promoted Protestant reformers, giving Henry books like William Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man that would influence his thinking about royal supremacy. When Henry finally broke with Rome to marry Anne, it wasn't just personal, it was the beginning of the English Reformation. Anne Boleyn didn't just marry the king, she helped create a new England where the monarch, not the Pope, was head of the church. But Anne's revolutionary approach to queenship also contained the seeds of her destruction. She never learned to be submissive, even when her position became precarious. She continued to argue with Henry, to express strong opinions, and to expect to be treated as his intellectual equal. When she failed to produce a male heir after Elizabeth's birth in 1533, the political ground shifted beneath her. Her enemies, including her own uncle Thomas Howard, began plotting against her. The same intelligence and strong will that had won her the crown now made her vulnerable to charges of adultery and treason. Here's what's most tragic about Anne's fall. She was probably innocent of the adultery charges. The evidence against her was fabricated, the timeline was impossible, and the men accused with her were clearly chosen for political reasons rather than personal ones. Anne Boleyn was destroyed not because she was guilty, but because she had made too many enemies, and Henry had grown tired of her strength. But even facing death, Anne maintained her dignity and efficiency. She worried whether her headdress would interfere with the executioner's sword, and made practical arrangements for her burial. Her famous last speech was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that protected her daughter while maintaining her innocence. Anne Boleyn ranks fourth because her impact on English history is immeasurable. Through her influence on the Reformation and her daughter Elizabeth I, she shaped England's future more than any other queen. But her survival skills ultimately proved inadequate to the forces she had helped unleash. She won the greatest prize, changing England forever, but paid the ultimate price for refusing to be tamed. In the deadly game of Tudor queenship, Anne Boleyn played for the highest stakes and achieved revolutionary success, but she couldn't sustain it long enough to secure her position. Her legacy lives on through Elizabeth I, who inherited her mother's intelligence, will, and refusal to be diminished by anyone. In that sense, Anne Boleyn achieved a kind of immortality that none of Henry's other wives could claim. Think about this: without Anne Boleyn, there would have been no English Reformation, no Elizabeth I, and no Shakespearean Golden Age. She literally changed the course of world history. But in the short-term, deadly game of surviving Henry VIII, her revolutionary approach ultimately led to the Tower of London. Number 3. Catherine of Aragon, the Unbreakable Queen. Catherine of Aragon possessed something that none of Henry's other wives could claim. She was born to be queen, and that royal dignity, combined with political intelligence and unshakable religious conviction, made her one of the most formidable opponents Henry ever faced. Catherine was born in 1485, the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs who had unified Spain and funded Columbus's voyages to the New World. She grew up in one of Europe's most powerful courts, learning statecraft from parents who were reshaping the political map of Europe. When Catherine arrived in England in 1501 to marry Henry's older brother Arthur, she brought with her the political sophistication of the Spanish court, and an education that surpassed most men of her time. She was fluent in Latin, French, and Spanish, knowledgeable in philosophy and theology, and trained in the diplomatic arts by some of Europe's most skilled politicians. After Arthur's death in 1502, Catherine found herself in a precarious position, a foreign widow whose political value depended on remarrying into the English royal family. For 7 years, she lived in near poverty while Henry VII and her father-in-law negotiated her future. But these years taught Catherine something invaluable: how to survive through dignity and determination when the odds were stacked against her. When Henry VIII married Catherine in 1509, she seemed to have achieved the perfect queenship. She was beautiful, intelligent, pious, and politically valuable. She served as Henry's partner in the early years of his reign, advising him on policy and representing England with dignity at international events. But Catherine's greatest strength, her royal dignity, would ultimately become the weapon she used against Henry when he tried to divorce her. When Henry began questioning the validity of their marriage in the late 1520s, Catherine didn't just resist. She fought with every political and legal weapon at her disposal. Here's where Catherine's brilliance becomes clear. She understood that this wasn't just about her marriage, but about the legitimacy of her daughter Mary and the political relationship between England and Spain. Her nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was one of the most powerful men in Europe. Divorcing Catherine meant challenging the Spanish alliance and risking international consequences. Catherine's resistance speech to Henry in 1529 is one of the most powerful statements of feminine dignity in English history. "Sir, I beseech you, for all the loves that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure." But Catherine didn't just make emotional appeals. She fought Henry with legal and political weapons. She appealed to Rome, marshalled international support, and forced Henry into increasingly radical solutions. Her resistance directly catalyzed the English Reformation, because Henry couldn't get his annulment through traditional channels. For 6 years, Catherine refused to acknowledge the validity of Henry's second marriage to Anne Boleyn. She continued to sign her letters, Catherine the Queen, and insisted on being addressed with royal titles. She turned her exile into a form of resistance, maintaining her dignity even as Henry's agents tried to break her spirit. What's most remarkable about Catherine is how she balanced political resistance with personal grace. Even as Henry grew increasingly cruel, denying her access to their daughter Mary, reducing her household, and eventually imprisoning her at Kimbolton Castle, Catherine never resorted to public criticism or personal attacks. Catherine's survival strategy was radically different from the wives who came after her. Where they adapted and accommodated, Catherine held firm to her principles regardless of the consequences. She believed she was Henry's only legitimate wife before God, and she was willing to die for that conviction. And die she did at Kimbolton Castle in January 1536, still insisting on her status as Henry's true queen. But her death was a victory in disguise. She had forced Henry to break with Rome, establishing a precedent for royal defiance of papal authority that would ultimately serve England's interests for centuries. Catherine of Aragon ranks third because she combined political intelligence with unshakable moral conviction to wage one of the most effective resistance campaigns in Tudor history. She couldn't save her marriage, but she preserved her daughter's legitimacy and forced changes that reshaped England forever. In the deadly game of Tudor queenship, Catherine played the longest and most principled campaign, turning her exile into a form of political testimony that outlasted Henry's attempts to erase her. She lost the battle but won the war for historical memory. Here's what I find most admirable about Catherine. She never compromised her core beliefs, even when compromise might have saved her. In an age when women were expected to be malleable, Catherine of Aragon was granite, beautiful, dignified granite that Henry spent 6 years trying to break and never could. Number 2, Anne of Cleves, the master of strategic retreat. Anne of Cleves achieved something extraordinary in Tudor England. She survived Henry VIII, thrived after their divorce, and lived comfortably for 17 years while watching her successors rise and fall. Her secret? She mastered the art of strategic retreat better than any other royal wife in English history. Anne was born in 1515 in Dusseldorf, daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves. Her upbringing was conservative and Germanic. She could barely speak English when she arrived in England, had received little formal education, and knew nothing of the sophisticated court games that had become essential for survival in Henry's England. This apparent disadvantage would prove to be her greatest strength. The marriage was Thomas Cromwell's idea, a political alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany that would strengthen England's position in European politics. Henry agreed to the marriage based on Hans Holbein's flattering portrait, but when they met in person at Rochester in January 1540, the encounter was disastrous. Henry, in his romantic delusions, had disguised himself to surprise Anne with a chivalric gesture, the kind of courtly romance he'd read about in books. When he burst into her chambers at Rochester and tried to embrace her, Anne was horrified. She pushed him away and reportedly cursed in German, having no idea this large, smelly stranger was supposed to be her romantic destiny. Any other woman might have panicked when she realised she just physically rejected the King of England. Not Anne. When Henry returned in his royal robes, Anne graciously received him with proper ceremony, showing she could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. But the damage was done. Henry complained that Anne was nothing so well as she was spoken of, and that he liked her not well. The marriage proceeded only because the political arrangements were too far advanced to cancel, but Henry was looking for an exit strategy from their wedding day. Here's where Anne's genius became apparent. When Henry asked for an annulment 6 months later, Anne didn't fight him. She didn't resist like Catherine of Aragon or try to manipulate him like Anne Boleyn might have. Instead, she negotiated. Anne's survival strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. She gave Henry what he wanted and made sure she was generously compensated for it. She agreed to the annulment and received in return the title, the King's beloved sister, precedence over all other women in England, except Henry's wives and daughters, and generous financial settlements, including 2 beautiful manor houses. But Anne's intelligence went deeper than just knowing when to retreat. She learned English rapidly, adapted to English customs with enthusiasm, and maintained friendly relationships with all of Henry's subsequent wives and children. She attended Mary Tudor's coronation as Queen, remained close to Elizabeth, and even hoped briefly that Henry might remarry her after Catherine Howard's execution. What's most remarkable about Anne is how she turned potential humiliation into triumph. She could have returned to Cleves in disgrace, but instead, she chose to remain in England and build a life of dignity and independence. She became one of the wealthiest women in England, with her own household, her own political influence, and the freedom to live as she chose. Anne's relationship with Henry after their divorce shows her sophisticated understanding of royal psychology. She remained friendly and deferential, never challenging his decision, but always maintaining her dignity. Henry, relieved that she wasn't going to cause him political problems, treated her with genuine affection and respect. Think about this. Anne of Cleves is the only one of Henry's wives who got what she wanted from the marriage. She gained wealth, status, and independence, luxuries that most women of her time could never achieve. She turned rejection into liberation and disappointment into opportunity. Anne's survival skills were perfect for Henry's temperament. She understood that his greatest fear was being trapped or controlled, so she offered him complete freedom while negotiating excellent terms for herself. She read the political moment perfectly and chose accommodation over resistance. For 17 years after her divorce, Anne lived comfortably in England, watching Henry's later wives with what must have been a mixture of sympathy and relief. She outlived Henry by 10 years, dying peacefully in 1557 at the age of 41, ancient by Tudor standards. Anne of Cleves ranks second because she achieved something none of Henry's other wives managed. She escaped the deadly game of royal marriage with her life, her dignity, and her independence intact. She lost the title of queen but gained something far more valuable: freedom. In the deadly mathematics of Tudor survival, Anne of Cleves calculated perfectly. She understood that sometimes winning means knowing when to lose gracefully, and she turned strategic retreat into personal triumph. Her story proves that intelligence isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about recognizing when the smartest move is to step aside and let the other players destroy themselves while you watch from safety. Can you imagine the conversations Anne must have had with herself as she watched Catherine Howard's downfall and Catherine Parr's dangerous theological debates? She had found the secret to surviving Henry VIII: give him what he wants, take what you can get, and never, ever try to change him. Number 1. Catherine Parr, the Queen who conquered all. Catherine Parr stands alone at the top of our ranking, and here's why. She's the only wife who completely mastered the deadly game of royal marriage to Henry VIII. She survived him, influenced his children, shaped religious policy, became England's first female author queen, and then, most remarkably, found true love and happiness in her own marriage after Henry's death. Catherine was born around 1512 to Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, giving her excellent connections to the English nobility. But what set Catherine apart wasn't her birth. It was her extraordinary education and intelligence. She was fluent in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish, knowledgeable in philosophy and theology, and possessed political instincts that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. By the time Henry noticed her in 1543, Catherine was already twice widowed and had learned to manage difficult men through careful psychological manipulation. Her first marriage to Edward Burgh was brief. He died when she was still very young. Her second marriage to John Neville, Lord Latimer, was more significant. Latimer was involved in the dangerous pilgrimage of Grace Rebellion, and Catherine had to navigate the political fallout while protecting her stepchildren and managing estates. These experiences taught Catherine something invaluable: how to survive by being indispensable. When Henry began courting her, Catherine was secretly in love with Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour. But she understood the political realities. As she later wrote, it was better to be a wife than a victim. Catherine's survival strategy was sophisticated beyond anything attempted by Henry's previous wives. She positioned herself not just as a wife, but as Henry's intellectual companion and spiritual advisor. She engaged him in theological discussions, flattered his learning, and made him feel like the wise scholar he desperately wanted to be. But Catherine's brilliance went beyond just managing Henry's ego. She understood that lasting influence required institutional change, not just personal charm. As queen, she worked systematically to reconcile Henry with all three of his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. This wasn't just kindness, it was political genius that would influence the succession for generations. Catherine's greatest test came in 1546, when Conservative Bishop Stephen Gardiner orchestrated a plot to have her arrested for heresy. Catherine had been promoting Protestant reforms and discussing theology with Henry, dangerous activities for a queen in an era when religious difference could mean death. When Catherine learned of the plot, she didn't panic. Instead, she employed psychological manipulation so masterful it deserves to be studied by modern politicians. She went to Henry and claimed that she only argued theology to distract him from his painful leg ulcers, insisting that she was merely a woman learning from his superior wisdom. Henry was completely convinced. When Gardiner arrived with the arrest warrant, Henry chased him away, calling him a knave and a fool. Catherine had not only saved her life, but completely restored Henry's favour through pure psychological brilliance. But Catherine's accomplishments went far beyond mere survival. She served as Regent of England during Henry's 1544 French campaign, handling military supplies, finances, and administration with remarkable skill. She was the first English queen to publish under her own name. Her book Prayers Stirring the Mind unto Heavenly Meditations became a bestseller and established her as England's first female author queen. Most importantly, Catherine influenced the Third Succession Act, which restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. Without Catherine's influence, Elizabeth might never have become queen, and English history would have been entirely different. Think about what Catherine accomplished. She managed Henry's volatile moods, survived a heresy plot, served as regent, influenced religious policy, restored the royal children to succession, published influential books, and maintained her dignity throughout. That's not luck, that's genius-level political skill. But Catherine's true triumph came after Henry's death in January 1547. Finally free to follow her heart, she married Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved for years, but couldn't marry while Henry lived. For the first time in her life, Catherine experienced genuine romantic happiness. She wrote to Thomas with touching honesty about their love. "I would not have you think that this mine honest good will toward you to proceed of any sudden motion of passion. For as truly as God is God, my mind was fully bent, the other time I was at liberty, to marry you before any man I know." Catherine's pregnancy at age 35 was dangerous, but joyful. She was finally experiencing the love and family life she had always wanted. Tragically, she died from puerperal fever shortly after giving birth to her daughter Mary Seymour in September 1548. But even her death was different from her predecessors. She died surrounded by love, not betrayal or political intrigue. Catherine Parr ranks first because she achieved something unprecedented. She completely mastered the art of surviving Henry VIII while maintaining her integrity, intelligence, and ultimately her happiness. She understood that successful queenship required being indispensable rather than just desirable. Her influence extended far beyond her own life. Through her work on the succession, England gained Elizabeth I. Through her religious writings, she influenced the Protestant Reformation. Through her example as an intellectual woman, she expanded possibilities for female authority. But what I find most admirable about Catherine Parr is this: she never lost sight of her own humanity while playing the political game. She survived Henry's court without becoming cynical, cruel, or manipulative. She remained capable of love, joy, and genuine human connection, even after navigating one of history's most dangerous political environments. In the deadly game of Tudor queenship, Catherine Parr didn't just survive, she won. She outlived Henry, shaped England's future, and finally claimed the love and happiness she deserved. She proved that with sufficient intelligence, psychological insight, and careful planning, even Henry VIII could be managed and outlasted. Catherine Parr stands alone among Henry's wives because she achieved the impossible. She played the game perfectly and emerged not just alive, but triumphant. Now that we've ranked all 6 wives, let's step back and examine the broader patterns. What did survival in Henry's court actually require? And what do these women's stories tell us about power, intelligence, and resilience in one of history's most dangerous political environments? The first thing that becomes clear is that traditional feminine virtues, beauty, charm, fertility, were never enough. Henry married the most beautiful women of his age, but beauty faded and charm wore thin under the pressure of his increasingly paranoid demands. The wives who survived longest were those who offered him something beyond physical attraction: intellectual stimulation, political usefulness, or psychological comfort. Catherine Parr succeeded because she made herself indispensable as Henry's intellectual companion and spiritual advisor. Anne of Cleves survived by understanding when to retreat gracefully. Catherine of Aragon endured through royal dignity and political resistance. These were not passive strategies, they required sophisticated understanding of psychology, politics, and timing. The second pattern is that survival required constant adaptation. Henry's needs and mood changed dramatically throughout his reign. The young, athletic king who married Catherine of Aragon was entirely different from the paranoid, ulcerated tyrant who married Catherine Parr. The wives who survived were those who could read these changes and adapt their strategies accordingly. But perhaps most importantly, these women's stories reveal that intelligence and education were the most reliable survival tools. Every wife who lived to see old age was highly educated and politically sophisticated. Catherine Parr spoke 4 languages and published books. Anne of Cleves quickly learned English customs and court politics. Catherine of Aragon brought the diplomatic skills of the Spanish court. In contrast, the wives who died young, Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn, were destroyed by different forms of political miscalculation. Catherine Howard was too young and poorly educated to navigate court dangers. Anne Boleyn was brilliant but refused to submit when her position became precarious. The third crucial factor was timing. Jane Seymour's early death paradoxically saved her from potentially falling from favour. Anne Boleyn's revolutionary approach worked perfectly until she failed to produce a male heir. Catherine Howard's youth and inexperience might have been charming in a different political moment. What's most remarkable about these 6 women is how they each found different paths through the same impossible situation. There was no single strategy for surviving Henry VIII. Success required reading his psychology and the political moment, then adapting accordingly. Their stories also reveal the broader constraints facing all women in Tudor England. Legal doctrine of coverture meant married women had no independent legal existence. Professional opportunities were virtually non-existent. Economic dependence was almost universal. Yet within these constraints, Henry's wives found ways to exercise remarkable agency and influence. Think about what these women accomplished despite facing systematic oppression. Catherine of Aragon forced the English Reformation through her resistance. Anne Boleyn changed England's religious and political landscape. Jane Seymour provided the male heir who secured Tudor succession. Anne of Cleves created a new model for dignified independence. Catherine Howard, despite her tragic end, revealed the human cost of political marriage. Catherine Parr influenced succession law and became England's first female author queen. Each of them, in their own way, refused to be merely passive victims of Henry's will. They found ways to assert their humanity, intelligence, and agency within a system designed to reduce them to political instruments. Here's what strikes me most about these rankings. The wives who succeeded weren't necessarily those who made Henry happiest. Catherine Parr often challenged him intellectually. Anne of Cleves rejected him physically. Catherine of Aragon defied him politically. But they survived because they understood that lasting influence required more than momentary royal favour. The tragic irony is that Henry's search for the perfect submissive wife ultimately led him to marry some of the most intelligent and strong-willed women of his age. He needed their political skills and intellectual capabilities to help him rule, but he also demanded complete submission to his authority. This contradiction created the deadly tension that destroyed so many of his marriages. To truly understand how these women survived, or failed to survive, we need to step inside the Tudor court itself. Picture Hampton Court Palace on a winter evening in 1540. Tapestries hang heavy with the scent of herbs meant to mask less pleasant odours. Candles flicker in draughty corridors where courtiers gather in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the latest rumours. This was no fairy tale castle, it was a political battlefield, disguised as a palace, where a misplaced word could mean exile and a misinterpreted glance could mean death. The court moved constantly. Every 6 weeks, the entire household of up to 1,000 people would pack up and relocate. This wasn't for pleasure, it was practical necessity. Medieval sanitation meant that after 6 weeks, any building housing that many people would become uninhabitable. The smell alone would be overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, human waste, and the sweet, sick scent of herbs trying desperately to mask it all. In this world, queens lived under constant scrutiny. Every morning, they woke to find their bedchamber filled with ladies in waiting, each one a potential spy for rival factions. Their conversations were monitored, their letters read, their friendships analysed for political significance. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. The daily routine of a Tudor queen was exhausting in its formality. Catherine of Aragon described having to dress each morning while surrounded by women who examined every gesture for signs of the king's favour or displeasure. A queen who appeared tired might spark rumours of pregnancy or illness. One who seemed too cheerful might be suspected of having secret reasons for joy. Mealtimes were theatrical performances where seating arrangements carried political weight, and every course was tasted by others before reaching the royal lips. Queens ate in public while courtiers watched, analysing their appetite for clues about their health, mood, or relationship with the king. But here's what's truly chilling. These women were always surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Their servants reported to various nobles. Their companions had their own political agendas. Even their most intimate ladies-in-waiting might be placed there by enemies, hoping to gather intelligence. Anne Boleyn discovered this isolation brutally when her arrest was ordered. The women who had surrounded her for years suddenly refused to meet her eyes. Catherine Howard found herself abandoned by the Howard family members who had orchestrated her rise to power. In the Tudor court, loyalty was always conditional, and queens learned that they could trust no one completely. The physical dangers were matched by psychological ones. Henry's courtiers had perfected the art of political manipulation, using gossip and innuendo as weapons. A queen's enemies might spread rumours about her fertility, her fidelity, or her religious beliefs. These weren't harmless court gossip. They were character assassinations that could lead to actual execution. Think about this. Every one of Henry's wives had to navigate not just the king's volatile moods, but also the competing interests of the Howard faction, the Seymour faction, the Parr faction, and dozens of other political groups all manoeuvring for advantage. A queen who allied too closely with one group would automatically make enemies of all the others. The religious tensions made everything more dangerous. During Henry's reign, England was torn between Catholic and Protestant influences, and queens were expected to take positions that could later be reframed as heresy. Catherine of Aragon was too Catholic for Henry's later Protestant phase. Anne Boleyn was too Protestant for Catholic enemies. Catherine Parr nearly died for her Protestant sympathies. And threading through all of this was the constant, suffocating pressure of Henry's presence. He was not a distant monarch. He was intimately involved in court life, watching everyone, testing loyalties, and changing his mind about people with terrifying unpredictability. His physical presence alone was intimidating. By his later years, he was massive, often in pain from his ulcerated leg, and given to explosive rages. that could destroy careers in moments. The queens who survived were those who learned to read the undercurrents of this treacherous environment. Catherine Parr understood that her greatest danger came not from Henry, but from conservative bishops who saw her Protestant sympathies as threats. Anne of Cleves recognised that resistance would only bring misery and chose accommodation instead. But perhaps most remarkably, these women found ways to build genuine relationships within this atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal. Catherine of Aragon maintained the loyalty of her Spanish ladies for decades. Anne Boleyn created a circle of reformist intellectuals who supported religious change. Catherine Parr formed friendships with Henry's children that outlasted her own life. I often wonder how they slept at night, knowing that any day might bring accusations of treason or adultery. How did they wake each morning and face another day of performance, knowing that a single mistake could mean death? The psychological strength required just to function in this environment was extraordinary. Here's what I find most touching. Despite the constant danger and isolation, these women continued to hope for happiness. They fell in love, pursued intellectual interests, tried to protect their stepchildren, and dreamed of futures beyond the court's suffocating constraints. Their humanity shines through the political manoeuvring, reminding us that these weren't just historical figures, but real women facing impossible choices with courage and intelligence. The Tudor court was designed to break people, to reduce them to frightened sycophants who would do anything to preserve their lives and positions. That any of Henry's wives maintained their dignity and agency within this system is testimony to their remarkable strength. Now let's talk about the one expectation that overshadowed everything else in these women's lives: producing a male heir. This wasn't just hope or desire, it was a political necessity that literally meant the difference between life and death for Henry's queens. Understanding the brutal pressure of Tudor succession requires stepping back into a world where infant mortality was catastrophic, where women routinely died in childbirth, and where the failure to produce sons was seen as God's judgment on a marriage. For Henry's wives, pregnancy wasn't just personal, it was a political performance, with their lives as the stakes. Catherine of Aragon's tragic reproductive history reveals the human cost of these expectations. She suffered at least 6 documented pregnancies between 1509 and 1518. Only one child survived to adulthood, Princess Mary, born in 1516. The others were miscarriages, stillbirths, or babies who died within weeks of birth. Each loss wasn't just personal grief, but political catastrophe. Court physicians would examine the fetal remains for signs of God's displeasure. Courtiers would whisper about whether the Queen was being punished for secret sins. Henry himself would retreat into brooding silence, analysing whether his marriage was cursed. The pressure was so intense that queens often hid miscarriages or announced pregnancies prematurely, hoping desperately that this time would be different. Catherine of Aragon once believed herself pregnant for months, her belly swelling with what we now recognise as a phantom pregnancy brought on by psychological stress. The court prepared for a royal birth that never came, and Catherine's humiliation was complete. Anne Boleyn faced even greater pressure because her entire justification for displacing Catherine was her supposed ability to bear sons. When Elizabeth was born, in 1533, Henry's disappointment was barely concealed. He had broken with Rome, defied European opinion, and split his kingdom religiously, all for a son. Instead, he got another daughter. The pressure only intensified with each subsequent miscarriage. Anne suffered at least 2 more pregnancy losses after Elizabeth's birth, including what appears to have been a male fetus in January 1536. This final miscarriage may have sealed her fate. Henry saw it as proof that God was displeased with their marriage. Think about this horror. Anne Boleyn was arrested and executed just months after losing what might have been the son Henry desperately wanted. Her failure to carry that pregnancy to term, quite literally, cost her life. Jane Seymour understood these stakes perfectly, which makes her success even more remarkable. She gave Henry his precious male heir, but the cost was her own life. Puerperal sepsis, infection following childbirth, was a leading cause of maternal death in the 16th century. Jane's death reminds us that even successful pregnancies were often death sentences for the mothers. But here's what's truly chilling. Henry's reaction to Jane's death reveals how completely he had reduced these women to their reproductive function. He mourned Jane, yes, but within days was asking his counsellors to begin searching for a fourth wife. The woman was dead, but the need for more heirs remained. Catherine Howard never had the chance to prove her fertility, but the pressure was clearly weighing on her young mind. Court observers noted that she seemed increasingly anxious about pregnancy, asking questions about childbirth that revealed her terror of the process. She was executed before she could face the physical dangers that had killed Jane Seymour, but the psychological pressure was already destroying her. Anne of Cleves escaped this particular horror by agreeing to annulment before her reproductive fitness could be tested. This might have been the smartest decision any of Henry's wives made. She avoided both the physical dangers of childbirth and the political consequences of failing to produce sons. Catherine Parr, remarkable as always, managed to navigate even this impossible situation with intelligence. She never became pregnant during her marriage to Henry, which might have been deliberate. At 31 when they married, she was old enough to understand the dangers and sophisticated enough to manage the situation carefully. When Catherine did finally become pregnant after Henry's death, it was in the context of a loving marriage to Thomas Seymour. Even then, the pregnancy killed her, proving that maternal mortality was a threat no woman could completely escape. The medical realities of Tudor pregnancy were terrifying. No anesthesia meant that labour pain was endured fully conscious. No understanding of infection meant that contaminated instruments and unwashed hands routinely killed new mothers. No blood transfusions meant that hemorrhages were almost always fatal. Yet these women faced pregnancy knowing these dangers because they had no choice. Their lives, their positions, and their families' futures all depended on their ability to produce living sons. The pressure was so intense that it affected their health, their relationships, and their mental well-being. Here's a question that gets me. How many of these women might have lived longer, happier lives if they had been valued for their intelligence, political skills, and human worth rather than their reproductive capacity? Catherine of Aragon was a brilliant diplomat. Anne Boleyn was a gifted political strategist. Catherine Parr was a talented writer and religious thinker. But in Henry's world, all of their other accomplishments were secondary to the one thing that ultimately lay beyond their control: the sex of their children. It's a reminder of how completely women's lives were reduced to their biological functions, even for queens who wielded enormous political power. The tragic irony is that Henry's obsession with male heirs ultimately proved misguided. His son, Edward VI, died young and childless. His daughter Elizabeth, whom he initially dismissed as worthless, became England's greatest monarch. The women he discarded for failing to produce sons were often far more valuable than the sons he desperately sought. In ranking these wives, we must remember that their greatest battles weren't just against Henry's moods or court factions, but against a biological lottery that determined their fate regardless of their intelligence, courage, or political skill. That any of them found ways to assert their worth beyond their reproductive function is testimony to their remarkable strength and humanity. As we near the end of our journey through the Tudor court, I want to pose a question that might change how you think about these remarkable women. What if we've been judging them by the wrong standards all along? For centuries, historians have evaluated Henry's wives primarily through his eyes, as successes or failures in their role as royal consorts. But what if we judge them instead as individual women navigating an impossible system? What if we measure their success not by how well they pleased Henry, but by how brilliantly they preserved their humanity under inhuman pressure? When I first began researching these women years ago, I expected to find 6 variations on the same theme. Women destroyed by a tyrant's whims. Instead, I discovered 6 completely different strategies for survival, each revealing different aspects of feminine intelligence and strength. Catherine of Aragon taught us that sometimes dignity is more important than compromise. Her refusal to acknowledge Henry's second marriage wasn't just stubbornness, it was a principled stand that preserved her daughter's legitimacy and forced England to confront the moral implications of royal divorce. Anne Boleyn showed us that revolution sometimes requires personal sacrifice. Her refusal to be Henry's mistress changed English history, even though it ultimately cost her life. Without Anne's 7-year resistance, there might have been no English Reformation, no Elizabeth I, no Shakespearean Golden Age. Jane Seymour demonstrated that careful performance could achieve remarkable results. Her strategic submissiveness wasn't weakness but psychological sophistication that gave Henry the one thing he wanted most, a male heir, while positioning her family for generations of influence. Anne of Cleves proved that sometimes wisdom means knowing when to lose gracefully. Her acceptance of annulment transformed potential humiliation into personal liberation, making her the only wife who emerged from marriage to Henry with her independence intact. Catherine Howard's story reminds us of the human cost of political ambition. Her tragedy wasn't personal failure, but systemic abuse. A child sacrificed to adult political games who never had the chance to develop the skills necessary for survival. Catherine Parr showed us that intelligence and adaptability could triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. Her ability to be simultaneously submissive and influential, traditional and revolutionary, safe and dangerous, represents the highest achievement of Tudor queenship. But here's what strikes me most about these rankings. The women who rank highest aren't necessarily those who lived longest or died most comfortably. They're the ones who found ways to assert their agency and preserve their humanity within a system designed to crush both. Think about Anne Boleyn. She ranks 4th despite losing her head because she changed England forever. Her revolutionary approach to queenship created possibilities that didn't exist before. She died at 35, but her influence shaped centuries of English history. Compare that to Anne of Cleves, who ranks 2nd, partly because she lived quietly for 17 years after her divorce. She achieved safety and comfort, but her impact on history was minimal. Both strategies were valid, but they served different purposes and required different sacrifices. Catherine Parr ranks 1st not just because she outlived Henry, but because she found ways to exercise real influence while maintaining her safety. She shaped religious policy, influenced succession law, and became England's first female author queen, all while managing Henry's volatile temperament with psychological brilliance. The deeper I've delved into their stories, the more convinced I've become that these women were engaged in a form of resistance that we're only beginning to understand. They couldn't rebel openly or refuse their roles entirely, but they found subtle ways to subvert expectations and claim agency within constraint. Catherine of Aragon turned exiles into political testimony. Anne Boleyn used sexual refusal as revolutionary strategy. Jane Seymour employed submission as psychological manipulation. Anne of Cleves transformed rejection into liberation. Catherine Howard's very vulnerability became an indictment of the system that destroyed her. Catherine Parr made intellectual partnership the foundation of political influence. Each of them, in their own way, refused to be merely passive victims of Henry's will. They found cracks in the system and used them to assert their humanity, intelligence, and worth. Here's what I find most remarkable. Despite facing systematic oppression, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of death, these women continued to hope, love, learn, and dream. They formed friendships, pursued intellectual interests, and tried to protect the people they cared about. Their humanity shines through the political maneuvering. This brings us to the question I mentioned earlier. Which wife do you think showed the most courage? Was it Catherine of Aragon, standing firm in her principles despite exile and isolation? Anne Boleyn, refusing to be silenced even facing execution? Catherine Parr, risking heresy charges to promote religious reform? Or perhaps Anne of Cleves, having the wisdom to step away from a game that couldn't be won? The answer reveals as much about our own values as it does about these historical figures. Do we admire principled resistance more than strategic accommodation? Is survival itself a form of victory? Or does legacy matter more than longevity? As candles burn low in our imaginary Tudor chamber, what do these 6 women's stories teach us about power, survival, and the price of being female in a world designed by and for men? The first lesson is perhaps the most important. Intelligence is the most reliable survival tool, but it's never enough by itself. Every wife who lived to see old age was highly educated and politically sophisticated, but intellectual brilliance couldn't save Anne Boleyn from factional politics or protect Catherine Howard from her family's ambitions. The second lesson is that adaptation is essential, but it must be strategic rather than simply reactive. The wives who survived longest were those who could read changing circumstances and adjust their approaches accordingly while maintaining some core sense of self. Catherine Parr exemplified this perfectly. She could be submissive when Henry needed to feel dominant, intellectual when he wanted stimulating conversation, and spiritual when he sought religious comfort. But underneath these performances, she remained fundamentally herself, a brilliant, ambitious woman determined to influence her world. The third lesson is that timing matters as much as talent. Jane Seymour's early death saved her from potentially falling from favour. Anne Boleyn's revolutionary approach worked perfectly until she failed to produce a male heir. Catherine Howard's youth and inexperience might have been charming in a different political moment. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. These women found ways to assert their agency and preserve their dignity within a system designed to strip them of both. They couldn't change the rules of the game, but they found ways to play it on their own terms. Their strategies were remarkably diverse. Catherine of Aragon chose principled resistance. Anne Boleyn opted for revolutionary change. Jane Seymour employed strategic submission. Anne of Cleves pursued graceful retreat. Catherine Howard, tragically, never had the chance to develop a coherent strategy. Catherine Parr mastered psychological manipulation. None of these approaches was inherently superior. Success depended on reading the political moment correctly and choosing the strategy most likely to achieve individual goals. What's remarkable is how differently each woman interpreted the same impossible situation. The long-term impact of their choices extends far beyond their individual lives. Catherine of Aragon's resistance forced the English Reformation. Anne Boleyn's revolutionary approach created Elizabeth I. Jane Seymour provided Edward VI and the Protestant succession. Anne of Cleves modelled dignified independence. Catherine Howard's tragedy revealed the human cost of political marriage. Catherine Parr influenced religious policy and women's education. Collectively, they transformed the institution of English queenship from passive ornament to active political force. Future queens like Elizabeth I and Mary I inherited possibilities that these 6 women had created through their courage, intelligence, and sacrifices. Think about Elizabeth I's famous declaration, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. She could make that statement because her mother, Anne Boleyn, had demonstrated that queens could be more than decorative consorts, and her stepmother, Catherine Parr, had shown that feminine intelligence could be a source of political strength. The ranking we've explored tonight, Catherine Parr, Anne of Cleves, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Catherine Howard, reflects different ways of measuring success in an impossible situation. But all 6 women deserve recognition for their courage in facing circumstances that would have destroyed weaker spirits. They were products of their time, certainly, but they were also individuals who found ways to transcend the limitations of that time through intelligence, determination, and sheer force of will. Their stories continue to resonate because they reveal both the constraints women have faced throughout history and the remarkable ways individual women have overcome them. Women have found to assert their humanity despite those constraints. As we close this exploration of Henry VIII's 6 wives, I'm struck by how much of their story exists in the spaces between recorded facts. These women lived under constant surveillance, yet so much of their inner lives remains mysterious. We have Catherine Parr's theological writings, but what did she really think during those terrifying moments when heresy charges threatened her life? We know Anne Boleyn's last speech, but what passed through her mind during her final night in the Tower? We understand Jane Seymour's strategic submission, but did she ever resent the performance it required? The silence surrounding their private thoughts isn't accidental. Tudor women, especially queens, were expected to perform their roles without revealing the psychological cost. Their letters were read, their conversations monitored, their emotions analysed for political significance. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Yet sometimes their humanity breaks through the official records. Catherine of Aragon's letters to her chaplain reveal her genuine religious devotion alongside political calculation. Anne Boleyn's reported final words, worrying about whether her headdress would interfere with the executioner's sword, show both practical efficiency and touching vulnerability. Catherine Howard's letter to Thomas Culpeper, signing herself, "Yours as long as life endures," reveals the heart of a girl who still believed in love despite everything she had endured. Catherine Parr's joy in finally marrying Thomas Seymour shines through her formal correspondence, like sunlight through heavy curtains. These glimpses remind us that behind the political strategies and survival calculations were real women experiencing real emotions: fear, hope, love, despair, triumph, and loss. They weren't just historical figures, but individuals who laughed and cried, who worried about their appearance and their futures, who formed friendships and nursed grudges, who dreamed of happiness and sometimes achieved it. Their stories have captivated us for nearly 500 years because they combine the glamour of royal power with the universal human struggle to find meaning and agency within constraining circumstances. We see ourselves in their choices, their compromises, and their courage. In our ranking tonight, we've tried to honour not just their political achievements, but their personal courage, the daily bravery required to wake up and face another day of performance, surveillance, and danger. Whether they died young or lived long, whether they pleased Henry or defied him, whether they achieved their goals or fell short, they all demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of Tudor corridors where these 6 remarkable women once walked, each finding her own way through the deadly maze of royal marriage. They faced their challenges with intelligence, dignity, and an unbreakable determination to remain human in a system designed to reduce them to political pawns. Their legacy lives on not just in the history books, but in every woman who refuses to be diminished, who finds ways to assert her agency within constraint, who chooses intelligence over submission and dignity over safety. In that sense, the game they played with such skill and courage continues, and their example lights the way for all of us still fighting to be heard. Sweet dreams, and remember, you carry within you the same courage that enabled these 6 women to face down one of history's most dangerous kings. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're blueprints for survival, maps for navigating impossible situations, and reminders that, even in the darkest times, human intelligence and dignity can find ways to shine. Sleep well, knowing that you've spent this evening in the company of some of history's most remarkable women. And perhaps in your dreams, you'll hear their whispered secrets echoing through the centuries, sharing the wisdom they learned in the deadliest game ever played. Before I leave you tonight, I have one final question for you to ponder. If you had been born into their world, which survival strategy would you have chosen? Would you have stood firm like Catherine of Aragon, revolutionised like Anne Boleyn, retreated like Anne of Cleves, performed like Jane Seymour, or adapted like Catherine Parr? Your answer might surprise you, and it definitely reveals something profound about your own approach to impossible situations. Until next time, sweet dreams, and remember, courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving with your humanity intact.